Our next presenter is going to talk to us on the FEMA perspective on the new Space Weather Strategy and Action Plan. The presenter is the Honorable Craig Fugate, the FEMA Administrator. He was confirmed by the U.S. Senate and began his service as Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency in May of 2009. He has promulgated the whole community approach to the emergency management, emphasizing and improving collaboration in all levels of government, that's federal, tribal, state, and local, and external partners, including voluntary agencies, faith-based organizations, the private sector, and citizens. Prior to coming to FEMA, he served as Director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management. He served as the Florida State Coordinating Officer for 11 presidentially declared disasters, including the management of the $4.5 billion in federal disaster assistance. In 2004, he managed the largest federal disaster response in Florida history. Would you please join me in welcoming the Honorable Craig Fugate.
Well, good morning. When you talk about various scary scenarios, there's always the what I call the science fiction, worst case, everything's horrible, everything's going to go wrong, and then what really can happen. And so when you talk about risk and hazards, you always have to balance between the extreme views of it will never happen to, if it happens, there's nothing we can do about it. And that tends to be where hazards fall. It's either so bad, everybody goes, we can't do anything about it, it's such an infrequent event. We need to plan for things that happen more frequently and are more likely to happen. Well, when you talk about events like space weather, it falls into one of these categories that it may be so bad, who wants to think about it, and it doesn't happen very frequently. So therefore, let's focus on the floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, and things we know are going to happen more often. But when you look at hazard analysis, you have to look at two things. You have to look at the probability and frequency of events, and you have to look at the consequences of the events. And oftentimes, the sweet spot tends to be where people focus is the moderate to high frequency of events that have moderate to low consequence. We tend to look a little bit differently. At the federal level, we have to look at not just what can happen, because many of the things that people focus on every day actually are handled by state and local responders. We have to look at those events that have the ability or reach a threshold that requires significant federal response or have impacts on national security. And that's where you start looking at oftentimes what may be a low consequence, high, or low probability, high consequence event. So when I came to FEMA in 2009, first thing I asked them was, what are the plans for a G5 event in a space weather storm? And they just looked at me and go, what's a G5? What's space weather? And I had began this in Florida because we were looking at the various things that could impact as emerging threats. And what we find is it's not so much emerging threats as existing threats, but technology may have changed the impacts. And as we began this process, when I came to FEMA, it became clear that there were very few people outside of those at the Space Weather Prediction Center and a few people in industry that really understood what space weather was and what it was not. Oftentimes I hear two things that are confused, and they say, you know, space weather is the same thing as an EMP. They're not. They're two separate events. They may have similar consequences. They're two different types of events, and in fact what you would do is different in both of them. There's some similarities, but they're not the same. So I'm going to focus on space weather, understanding that many things we talk about would be similar systems impacted by electromagnetic pulse, particularly those generated by nuclear detonation in near space. But that's an act of war. I want to start with one that's a naturally occurring phenomenon that historically has happened and has been documented. If you go back to 1859, the Carrington event was a coronal mass ejection that occurred that produced all kinds of observations across the world. It was one of the most well-documented events. But at the time, the technology that was most severely affected was a new network that nobody really understood was a network, and that was telegraph systems. But what's interesting about this event is from the time the event occurred to it began impacting Earth, was estimated to be about 16 to 17 hours. Many of these coronal mass ejections move much slower, so we oftentimes have days to determine that an event has occurred, potentially it is coming our way, and have some chance to begin prepping for it. But take an event like the Carrington event and go, you got maybe 15 to 16 hours from the time the event is detected to impact. And working in those time frames, understanding that the impacts won't be known until it gets closer, but the time frames it takes to take protective actions oftentimes will fall outside of the decision-making cycle as it exists today. And what happens in one of these coronal mass ejections that comes towards Earth? We deal with several major phenomena, some of which are just caused by solar flares, but in a coronal mass ejection we deal with some additional things in the geomagnetic world that get very interesting as far as its impacts on infrastructure. But the Space Weather Prediction Center, if you're not familiar with it, we actually have a center that forecasts space weather. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They are one of the centers for environmental prediction, just like the National Hurricane Center, the Storm Prediction Center. It is a joint process of the Air Force and the National Weather Service through observation platforms and forecasting. And they forecast essentially the three hazards of space weather: radiation, HF radio propagation and blackouts, and geomagnetic storms. And they have scales assigned to them. And those scales indicate severity. And part of this was in place when I came on board in 2009. What was not in place was an understanding at the federal level of what these impacts were. There was no strategy. We had a detection system, and not so much even a warning system as much as we could get information out. But a warning is a little bit different than advisory, because when you talk about warnings, warnings are, this is an event, you need to do something differently. With a lot of the space weather advisories, there was not specific understanding of what do we need to do differently to protect. What were the impacts? How would you minimize those? And so let's talk about some of the impacts of a geomagnetic storm of a G5 or a Carrington-style event. Some of which are going to be essentially space impacts, others which will become terrestrial impacts. First one up and the fastest one to get here oftentimes is radiation. Generally, this will not affect terrestrial, but it does affect space, humans in space. This is one of the things that the International Space Station has to monitor. That's one of the reasons why they always keep one of the modules on the space station for escape, because it's the only place that has enough shielding to offer realistic protection in a radiation storm. It affects high-flying aircraft, going particularly polar routes. And it impacts satellites because it can produce all kinds of static discharge and impacts, particularly on non-shielded satellites. Then you have the impacts of the HF. HF radio propagation is still used by many agencies. It's one of the backup, and this is what's kind of interesting. In communication, or take a cyber event where you have massive disruptions in communications, HF radio is still one of those systems that is used as a backup, but in a geomagnetic storm can be rendered useless. And so those systems that use HF radio, including a lot of aircraft that are transiting the Pacific and Atlantic, still use HF radio for commercial aircraft to get and update information. Those systems can be degraded, and anybody that's using that, basically from 1 to 30 megahertz, is at risk from disruptions. But the one that tends to get the most attention are the terrestrial impacts and some of the impacts in satellites from the geomagnetic storm itself. What we have observed and what happened and why Carrington was so interesting was the first time we saw a wired network that could actually build up energy from a coronal mass ejection in a geomagnetic storm and produce large voltages across the system. The reports of the telegraph operators of the time were sparking, arcing, and getting shocked. When they disconnected their batteries, they could still transmit. There was that much energy in the lines. But at that time, the only thing that was networked was the telegraph system. And there wasn't that many places for it to really build up and produce surges beyond what they were observing. Fast forward to later years, we began seeing in some of these events, particularly the higher latitudes, impacts to the electrical grid. And what we found was those networks of a conducting material over long distances amplify the impacts. And primarily those are going to be pipelines and the electrical grid, particularly the transmission lines moving power across long distances. And that process that we have is kind of one of the things that within industry has produced a lot of interesting risk. And that is we tend to generate power at very large quantities away from where it's consumed. And then we transport it long distances to get to where the demand is. And because demand is never going to be static, that ability to move power long distances is not always in the same direction. It can be moving power across the country to where oftentimes where's the cheapest power production at and where's the highest consumption, and retailing power across these grids. So these systems are very complex. They move a lot of power. They're not always carrying the same loads. It's a very dynamic system that constantly changes depending upon demand and production. But the characteristic is you have large generation being transmitted long distances. That requires transformers. And this is where we found some of the first terrestrial impacts of geomagnetic storms, was in building up the electrical charges in the system, overloading, and what is referred to in the industry as very large transformers, or large transformers. There's no standard definition. I think Department of Energy uses, I think it's a 100 megawatt ampere as a kind of a threshold for what is a large transformer. But these are very important to the ability to move power across the grid long distances, of stepping up and stepping down power, and it is that has been seen as the most vulnerable because it's happened. Hydro-Quebec had a situation back where one of their storms produced enough energy in the system that it overloaded and began melting the core of the transformers. Now, if transformers were a commodity that was relatively inexpensive and easy to replace, this would be, okay, it's a light bulb, we change it. They're not. These tend to be very specialized, custom built, and very expensive with long lead times to build. There's not a lot in reserve, although the National Electric Reliability Council has been working with their members to build an inventory. But from the time frame of ordering one to having one delivered, oftentimes is measured in years. These are extremely large, oftentimes require specialized transport. And we also have an aging infrastructure. The United States has some of the oldest of the large transformers that are reaching the end of their cycles of lifetime and are going to be expected to be replaced anyway. So when you look at an aging infrastructure, you look at one piece of it. Now, there are other pieces that are affected, but the one that people tend to focus on are these large transformers. The fact that it has a limited manufacturing base and doesn't really have a lot sitting on the shelf because it's got to be custom built. It's a huge operation just transporting them. If you've ever seen them, they're the ones that have the specialized rail cars or trucks where they have to go in and literally shut down the roads and plan from where you're going to manufacture it to where it's going before you even place the order, because it doesn't do you any good to buy one that you can't get to where it goes. And in a geomagnetic storm, if no actions are taken to protect those systems, the power surge within the grid could potentially short out, melt, and destroy those transformers, which would essentially cripple the grid, because the ability now to get power from the generation to the consumption will be severely hampered or disrupted. And there is not much within the system as designed to offset those losses. And this could result in prolonged, debilitating power shortfalls. People like to say power outages. It doesn't always mean you're going to have power outages, but it can mean that you're going to have severely reduced levels of power, and that may now require further reductions in consumptions, and that time frame of recovery could be measured not just in hours to days, but in how long it takes to rebuild, reroute, or redirect the grid to get power where it needs to go. So within the world of the geomagnetic storms, these large-scale events, which basically they call them century events, they're about a once every 100 years, could get potentially to the level that would not just be a disruption and a flicker to the system, but could actually put enough energy in that if nothing was done, you could have significant impacts to those transformers. Other parts of this don't have to get to those 100 years events to see problems. One of the things that will happen in some of these geomagnetic storms is the upper atmosphere expands, increasing drag on low Earth orbiting satellites, where much of the GPS and other constellations sit, can be impacted. These systems would then be affected by the drag, shortened time of those, increased fuel consumption, lowering the lifetime of those, and in some cases actually causing enough disruption the satellites are lost. That also plays into radiation because very few commercial satellites are hardened for EMP, much less radiation from these storms. Military satellites and some commercials are, but again, the vulnerabilities are there. And what you'll start seeing too is in the disruption in the ionosphere, things like GPS signals become very erratic and can actually go off not just in meters, but in tens of meters. Particularly those that are just single channel. Dual channels can still be affected. And this is more pronounced the further south you are, because once you get to the equator, we already see disruption in GPS. It's not as good as it is in the northern latitudes. So you get satellites impact from what's going on in the ionosphere, but distorting signals and now degrading GPS accuracy. You get increased drag on satellites, and in some cases you can actually have satellite failures because of radiation overload, and that's oftentimes going to be in the commercial satellite industry communications where those disruptions, and it has happened. And as the industry builds for that, they try to address it, but it becomes a weight issue and a factor of lifetime of the satellite versus what's the risk and what's my return on investment. So the White House began looking at this in 2009, 2010, going, wait a minute, we do not have a strategy. We have bits and pieces, Department of Energy, FEMA's doing some exercises. There's not really a clear-cut answer of what we do. And in many cases, it was nobody really sat down and said, what are the risks across the enterprise which become a risk that become something of national significance versus localized or regionalized impacts. And so the White House began bringing in the subject matter experts, both industry as well as science, as well as those federal agencies that either had regulatory or dealt with consequences, and in this October released a national strategy for space weather and an action plan of things that agencies are going to do. Because one of our challenges has been, even though you may get a forecast and they may have a scale of a geomagnetic or radiation or HF, there's no corresponding action plans by agencies. What do you do when you have a G5? Who makes the call? What decisions have to be made? What do you advise the president may require actions to take beyond which agencies do every day? We know the answer is that you turn off the grid. That was somebody's, early on was the thought, well, if you isolate and turn off the grid, you minimize the impacts. But there are a lot of things that industry can do as well as consumers can do from the standpoint of minimizing impacts. But it still required agencies to know if you have a specific level event, this is what your plan says you're doing in concert with the rest of the federal agencies. And again, these will not be reoccurring space weather events that occur with some frequency and have some impacts. They don't rise to the level of changing how we do business. But when we see events that either could have a triggering event that requires that, this space weather strategy says each of the agencies enumerated will develop specific plans and guidelines based upon triggering events as well as preparing for consequences of that. In addition, the longer term is to look at how do we build more resiliency into the systems and look at what the potential single points of failures are, and are there ways for the federal government to mitigate that. Challenge is, as you well know, most of this is owned by the private sector. So again, is this something that we can work with the industries either through a regulatory framework, through a cooperative framework, through others? And essentially my joke is in the federal government, we essentially have two tools in dealing with the private sector, what I call bribes and extortion. Is it tax credits or is it regulation? What's the best tools? And part of that is get a consistent answer on what's the best things and best strategies to use to build resiliency. And one of the things that I think people are talking about is an outgrowth of things like smart grid. As long as we are dependent upon very long distance movement of power across systems to meet electrical demand in a very fluid situation, that in itself is one of the greatest vulnerabilities we have to geomagnetic storms. If our systems are designed to produce and consume power on a more local scale, not dependent upon that as much, or we have the ability for brief periods of time reduce our dependency on the long distance transmissions and use other maybe less efficient, less cost effective, but could be less vulnerable during that time frame, it means that we could then isolate those grids and reduce the risk totally. Again, as we work with the various industries, what are the best strategies? And the focus is primarily on the areas of the grid itself, particularly the long-distance transmission lines and the very large transformers, and those satellite systems which either through degradation or through damage could affect strategic interest. Communications, GPS timing signals, and those systems that are used frequently by both industries and government to perform our essential task. So at FEMA, we deal with consequences. I get asked all the time. In fact, Ted Koppel came in my office. I thought that was pretty interesting. You know, here's Ted Koppel in my office. I'm like, what did I do now? He says, no, I'm retired. I'm writing this book. I said, what's it about? He says, well, when the lights go out. And he was writing about cyber war and other things. And I said, well, I'm actually more worried about geomagnetic storms. And this tendency that people always get fixated on what causes it is FEMA deals with consequences. So what we look at in space weather is, although it's helpful to understand the risk and it's also helpful to know what our agencies are doing to work with industry to minimize that, our job is always coming back to the default of what if it goes out? What do you do then? And the reality is like I like to point out to people, you have to sometimes put things in context. As much as we talk about cyber, as much as we talk about EMP, and as much as we talk about geomagnetic storms, the squirrels still are the most devastating things to the grid. We've seen more power outages because of those varmints than we have from the others. It doesn't mean they can't happen, but we see power outages on a frequent basis. The general effect of a large-scale power outage that we deal with at FEMA is usually the result of a hurricane. Of all the natural hazards we deal with outside of space weather, hurricanes tend to be the most debilitating to the grid over long distances. Even tornadoes and earthquakes tend to be more isolated. So we've had experience of what it's like to go in there, and we start to see the interdependencies in the types of issues that will occur both immediately and downrange. And Sandy's a great example of that. When you look at Hurricane Sandy, and you look at the numbers, we had about 350,000 residents and businesses that were actually physically damaged by the storm. Yet what drove the response for the first 2 weeks was not the damages from the storm to those structures. It was a power outage. And that power outage drove everything from impacts to the basic electrical, water, and sewage systems, to gas, pharmacies, grocery stores, and the role of the federal government filling those gaps. And again, we're not designed to replace the private sector distribution infrastructure en masse. We can fill gaps. And so once the power came back on, the response smoothed out very quickly. But here's the numbers. It's estimated that when the power was out, we were impacting over 25 million people. Now, that's not 25 million customers, and it didn't mean 25 million people didn't have power. It meant that transportation, jobs, work, that whole sector. That's one of the most densely populated areas in the U.S. And so when you looked at what happened when you had power outages going for weeks versus what could occur in a geomagnetic storm, if the system, if everything we know did not get applied, if we did lose those very large transformers, if we did do significant damages to the grid, now you're looking at months to years. And we can tell you that our experience in the short run, and the longest we've really dealt with power outages in this country has been a couple of weeks to large populations. Once you move past a couple of weeks, dynamics change very quickly because systems and their ability to cope degrade fast. In the first couple of days, nobody was really concerned that the gas stations weren't open. By the end of the week, that was the major crisis we were dealing with. We couldn't get fuel out of the ports, we couldn't get fuel delivered, and what we could get delivered, you couldn't get in the cars. And so as you start looking at consequences for us, this is where this raises geomagnetic storms to an entirely different level of threat. It may be a low-frequency event. It has an extremely high consequence and now becomes a national security risk. Because in that situation, not only are we dealing with the public and the businesses that are directly impacted by the power outages, it will start pulling so many resources to begin to affect our economy in a way that starts having national implications versus the localized impacts of a disaster such as a hurricane. And remember, Sandy, just on the federal side of direct funding by the federal government, is over $60 billion. That does not count private insurance, lost businesses, and all the other costs associated with it. That would be dwarfed by a geomagnetic storm if we don't take action, we don't have plans, and we don't protect the systems that are most vulnerable. And so as that debate goes forward, the White House has got out for the first time now both the strategy of what the federal government will focus on and a template for the actions of agencies to begin those initial steps. And they may be very simplistic, but think about that. We need to correlate what actions you take based upon the level of these triggering events. And we generally look at triggering events being in the G4 to G5 range. Most likely for most systems it's a G5. A geomagnetic storm of that size of a Carrington event, what they call the century storms, the once every 100 year. Doesn't mean they only happen once every 100 years, it just means there's a 1% risk. But they're of such severity that if you don't have an action plan and you only have 15 to 17 hours to make a decision, and that decision is not a singular decision that says there's a button you push that says, you know, in case of geomagnetic storm, press here. There'll be a lot of cascading impacts that have to be coordinated across various agencies. You'll have 50 governors who will definitely be interested in what those impacts may be to them, whether or not they need to be looking at enhancing any of their capabilities, including activating or calling to active duty their National Guard. And if none of this costs any money, it's very easy to do. But there would be significant costs. There's going to be significant costs to industry who may have to make decisions about saving systems at the expense of lost revenue on the projection of an event which may or may not occur as devastating as initially thought. Because again, if you got 15 to 17 hours, we won't know for sure once we detect that coronary mass ejection how it's going to hit the Earth and whether it will hit us. And the other thing we're going to face is there's very few hazards outside of war that affects more than one nation. Well, this will not just be a national event. This will be a hemispheric event. And we've actually done exercises with our counterparts at the EU, within Sweden and others, because it is likely that in a Carrington-style event, we could have impacts across most of the northern hemisphere as the Earth rotates, because these effects went for about 24 to 36 hours. So it's not just whatever's facing the sun at that moment. It will be as the Earth rotates. And we may find ourselves, and this is where it really gets interesting on the international scale, of impacts across Europe, Canada, United States, and many of the resources we may be competing for, we're all competing for in a market that's very limited, has limited capacity, and has tremendous lead times to buy, source, and install the types of systems that may be at risk. So you can look at a lot of things that are generally going to be nation-specific. Geomagnetic storms and space weather of the Carrington style could be hemispheric, involving multiple nations who are both finding themselves disrupted at the same time, but also competing for resources. And if anybody's here from the electrical industry and you talk to the northern tier states, one of our biggest importers of power is from Hydro-Quebec. And they have been impacted, and they are more vulnerable because this, again, the closer you are to the Arctic, the more the impacts are. And we've already had events where Hydro-Quebec has had impacts. They have lost transformers. There have been disruptions. And again, if we're in a situation where it's the dead of winter, we have extremely high consumption rates for heating, we get a disruption, and the system cannot balance out with that loss. Even if it's just limited to Canada, it still impacts us. Correspondingly, summertime, again, if we have these triggering events during extreme power consumptions, there's even less resiliency in the system. Our best hope is it happens when we have moderate temperatures, low consumption, and we have enough backup and ability to take systems down to protect them without shutting down or turning out lights in major metropolitan areas. So the last thing I want to leave in case you want to ask any questions is this. New York City was kind of an interesting place during Sandy because the haves and have-nots were basically the demarcation line of who had power and who didn't. What if it wasn't just those areas in New York that were without power? What if it was New York, Boston, Philly, Trenton, that whole corridor that was without power? And it now wasn't measured in days to weeks. It was measured over a time scale much greater. Again, I'm not into the doomsday scenarios. I look at consequences. And the planning for that event and what we would do is vastly different than what we would do in a response to a hurricane. And it won't be just that area. It would be across much of the U.S. That's why I'm glad I live in Florida. Not only does it have mild winters, the two states that are least of impact from the impacts of these storms is actually Texas and Florida because of the way the interconnects work and how far south they are. But they would not be immune because of the other distribution disruptions that would occur. Because think of this, as we saw in Sandy, how many different supply chains require power to be effective, and how much capacity you lose when you have long-term disruptions. And it is quite startling how vertically integrated and how many single points of failure we start seeing when you turn the lights out for more than a couple of days. So with that, I'll take any questions you have. Sir?
One quick question. If we were to get a Carrington event tomorrow, the president says, we know it's coming, I'm not convinced that we're protected. I want this whole country to be dark in 12 hours. Does he have the authority to declare that kind of emergency?
Doesn't really matter. There's no way to turn it off. Well, I mean, again, it's one thing for the president to say, turn it off, and then you talk to industry and says, well, turn it off, and go, turn off what? What part are you turning off? How are you turning off? And again, this is not an EMP. So in some cases, if I can get away from the large, very long transmission lines and isolate those very large generators, that's all I need to do. So in many cases, just going off of commercial power and going on your generator pretty well isolates you from the event. If you have generation near the area, and you're not doing long transmission lines, there may not be a need to go there either. So there's no simple, you just turn the system off. Because the other problem is, if you turn the system off, think about this. You go dark across the country. You know how long it's going to take to turn it back on? It's no simple. This is the thing that we keep getting into, is the more we looked at this, the more the complexity and what industry began telling us, there's no off switch. And if you do manage to turn things off, it's not as easy as you turn it off and you bring it back on.
I thought that's what saved the great New York City during Sandy. Was Con Ed blacked out Lower Manhattan. When they blacked out Lower Manhattan, they were able to, a few days later, turn it back on.
Yeah, and that's not an uncommon approach. A utility can shut down parts of the grid. That's not what's the greatest risk in this. It's the transmission between the grids. And the fact that those systems are live and dynamic and always moving power. And because they're moving them over long distances, you may be able to isolate out. And what Con Ed could do, if they have enough, and this is one of the scenarios people look at, if Con Ed has enough residual power generation close enough where they could isolate themselves from the rest of the grid, they may be able to stay lit and minimize the risk from the impact. Because the greatest impact, again, is to the long transmission lines, and there are some lengths there that they start looking at increase your vulnerabilities. And so you may be able to do what they call islanding. If you can island yourself off from the grid, you can significantly reduce the impacts and stay lit. So that's why, again, there's not like an off switch. Sir?
So our foundation, the Foundation for Resilient Societies, looked at the president's authority. We think the president has authority to turn off about 55% of the generation, having the federal authorities and the NRC capacity to shut off the nuclear plants. But but we don't have it, given that we have a situation where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has exempted all the generator operators from participating in operational procedure, so we don't exercise it. And if we don't have presidential authority and an order, then basically the lawyers are going to say, you can't turn it off because there's liability. So how can we get from where we are now to a more prudent plan?
Well, you're not going to go leap from we don't have a good plan till we have all the answers. And that's why I would recommend you go back, and there's two pieces to the president's strategy. There's the strategy itself, and there's the implementation plan. We got to take some baby steps. Because within the regulatory frameworks and what authorities, agencies have, we've not really laid out, okay, who's got the authority in the Department of Energy to make that decision? If you remember on 9/11, the Transportation Secretary made a decision to ground all the aircraft. He had no legal authority to do that. He just did it. So part of this is to go back and go, by agency, what are the actionable steps based upon a century-style event that each agency would have? And now start running through, where do the attorneys tell us we don't have authority or we're not exercising authority we have? Part of this may be going back to Congress and going, we lack clear authority here, and either we need to have legislative language or we need to go back and look at how do we get industry to address these issues. And again, it comes back in a regulatory framework. What's the best way? Because for industry, there is cost associated with this, which are not going to be return on the investments unless everybody has to follow the same regulations. That's been one of the challenges is industry says we know this is a problem, but you got to understand, we have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. And when you're talking about investor-owned utilities, this is no small matter. And many of them say, look, we know what our challenges are, but unless everybody is compelled to do it, where's our incentive and how do we go back and show our investors that a very unlikely event is causing us to pull resources and money into areas that they're not getting back in shareholder returns? And so, I like this term resiliency because I've really come to the conclusion the more efficiency we build in the systems, the less resilient we become. And that's one of the things we keep finding as we continue to streamline and modernize systems. We've introduced variables that we don't quite understand of single points of failure that until you have a hazard like a geomagnetic storm to expose them, nobody was really thinking about what was happening as we went through electrical deregulation. We went into merchant plants. We continue to go with the bigger they are, the more efficient they are, but the further away we build them because nobody wants to have smokestacks in their backyard. And then we'd have to build power lines. And the industry can tell you one of the worst things right now is just trying to get power lines built so that they can reduce the dependency on those lines and increase carrying capacity. People don't want them, the NIMBYism. So this is not something that, again, if there was a switch you could press and the president could press it, yeah, we'd do it. The system's not even built that way, and that may not be the best answer. That's why, again, we have got to take baby steps. And so for the first time, we have a national strategy, White House policy on space weather. For the first time, and again, you may look at them and go, this isn't enough. Trust me, you got to start somewhere. It starts enumerating what agencies are now required to do to begin planning specifically those initial steps of a triggering event and what those actions are going to be. And as we go through that, some of the things that we are doing and have done is continue to do exercises of these events and work both with industry as well as with the federal agencies on how we respond, what are the impacts and the likelihood of that. And again, as industry has been doing this, they're starting to see some solutions of what they have internally to themselves that can better reduce their vulnerabilities because nobody has a vested interest in letting these systems go, losing those transformers and losing all the revenue and costs associated with it. So there is a vested interest on everybody to get the best answer. But there is no easy answer because the system was not built that way. In many cases, deregulation and how that industry evolved actually set up increased vulnerabilities. And it's not just to this. If you look at when, in regard, you guys talk about cyber, SCADA systems, and the ability to control and load balance very complex systems in a mercantile market. If those systems are disrupted, we end up with significant impacts to the system that will either do one of two things. Either power goes out or power consumption becomes very expensive, and we end up having to use very different types of fuels that may increase, again, pollution and other activities or cost to manufacture. So again, we know that as we look at systems and you keep looking at new risks, we didn't deal with cyber 20 years ago. Now, what is this impact? So just staying on to the geomagnetic storms, it's the first steps. And it took us a while to get it there. And I think, again, when the president starts asking about what's this thing called space weather, a lot of people that were saying this needed to be addressed finally had a voice in the White House asking the very question that needed to be asked. And so from the time the president says, hey, what is space weather and what are we doing about it, we've been able to move from almost like voices in the wilderness, because, I mean, think about it. You're going to the White House saying, you know, a Claritin event in 1859 would take out today's grid. And they're like going, well, that was in 1859. I got all these other things to deal with. Go away. From 2009, there was a handful of people at my level that even knew what space weather was. Now we have a policy and we have an action plan. Again, they're baby steps, but it's a movement in the right direction. You want to know what the foundation and you can do? It's putting pressure, because we will not complete it in this term. I can just tell you, what has to be done cannot be completed in a year. So you need to make sure this is an administration priority going forward, and that Congress holds the administration going forward accountable to implementing that plan. And as we learn what we need to do that we may not have authorities or resources to do, that we apply that or request those authorities to execute and build that resiliency. So with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Administrator Fugate. Before we go, I'd like to have John Pye come up and Gary Gardner come up. Gary Gardner is the National Chairman of InfraGard. John Pye is responsible for the program at the FBI. And first of all, we want to say it's because of folks like you who care about this. Back in 2011, InfraGard created a nationwide program to address space weather and any high-impact threat that could impact the country for a month or longer. And these are the folks who are involved in it from around the country. It's called the Electromagnetic Pulse Special Interest Group. But as you can see from our conference proceedings every year, there's a big sun, and there's a picture of an actual solar storm taken by someone on the International Space Station. But what we've done this last year, because of the work of the administration in the strategy and in the action plan, we organized a lot of top experts in industry and government to look at this. And we noticed that you were calling for the whole of community to respond and to planning and exercises. So we put together a rich bibliography and a triple threat exercise that looked at space weather, EMP, and cyber with either 1, 3, or 12-month nationwide consequence. And what we'd like to do is share this with you. Even though FEMA is the king of planning, we learn from you folks. And in fact, we appeal to the HC process and everything else in this work. But we would like to present this to you as the American public's response to a whole of community effort. And this is our whole of community effort gift to FEMA.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I got one thing to add. Have you found yourselves talking to a lot of business folks and they kind of look at you and you start talking about this stuff and they shake their head and blow you off? We were presenting this to NATO, and it was basically, we had a crowd like you, except they were all about to fall asleep, until the representative of Swiss Re got up. And this is something that's very powerful because it gets people attention. The representative of Swiss Re says, we've done our analysis and determined that a Clarington-style event is an uninsurable risk, and we're advising all of our clients to begin exempting geomagnetic storms from business continuity and business interruption and damages in their policies. Now think about that. Swiss Re, who will insure just about anything, has said a geomagnetic storm under current technology and current practices in industry is not an insurable risk, and they will no longer reinsure the industry for it. That may get a few people to pay more attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.